The Brood isn't just a film. It's an autopsy of human emotion, dissected, exposed, and left raw under the cold light of the screen. It doesn't whisper horror. It forces you to confront it, to see the damage love can cause when it curdles into something unrecognizable. Shot in Canada's barren winter and born from a director's personal devastation, The Brood is what happens when a filmmaker stops creating characters and starts documenting ghosts. David Cronenberg wasn't telling a story. He was preserving an emotional event, one that came from the wreckage of his own divorce, custody battle, and quiet unraveling. Nola Carveth isn't fiction. She's a weaponized symbol of resentment. The creatures that crawl from her aren't nightmares, they're metaphors, birthed in place of words too painful to say aloud. The husband, Frank, isn't heroic. He's helpless. The daughter? She absorbs it all without flinching. Critics didn't know where to place this film. It wasn't gore, but it bled. It wasn't about monsters, yet it left you feeling hunted. And Cronenberg never tried to explain it away. "This is what happens when you feel powerless," he once said. "I just turned it into something I could control." So what is The Brood, really? A body horror film? A psychological confession? A warning wrapped in flesh and silence? These are 20 weird facts you didn't know about The Brood, 1979. A film not designed to entertain, but to infect. Fact Hasson. This wasn't a script. It was a wound in disguise. David Cronenberg didn't write The Brood to explore a concept. He wrote it because there was no other way to process what was happening to him. In the middle of a crushing, emotionally charged divorce and a courtroom fight for custody of his daughter, he turned to film not as art but as a weapon. The screenplay wasn't fiction. It was a map of everything he feared he was losing. Nola, the mother in the film, isn't just an antagonist. She's a reconstruction of Cronenberg's own anxieties about his ex-wife, amplified, twisted, and externalized. Her children, those deformed, violent offspring, weren't symbols of horror. They were stand-ins for the emotional consequences of unresolved trauma passed on to the next generation. He later confessed that he didn't care if the film was too personal. He needed it to be. "It was the only way I could stay sane," he said. Critics labeled it cruel, misogynistic, even dangerous. But Cronenberg didn't apologize. So what are we really watching in The Brood? A horror story? Or a private scream rendered permanent? And if trauma can be turned into art, does that make the art more honest or more dangerous? Fact #2. They weren't monsters. They were masked children. The horror in The Brood doesn't rely on jump scares or blood. It relies on discomfort, the kind that sinks in when you realize those tiny figures attacking adults in the film weren't puppets or animatronics. They were real children, actual kids, barely old enough to understand the story, fitted into suffocating rubber suits, their faces hidden under disturbing, fleshy latex masks molded to erase expression. Jack Young, who led the creature effects team, said the suits were designed to feel wrong, like watching childhood malfunction. The masks didn't allow full breathing. Visibility was poor. In some cases, the eye holes didn't align properly. Children stumbled, fell, and got back up, creating movement that felt almost too realistic. Crew members reportedly found the shooting days with the children the hardest, not because the kids misbehaved, but because the uncanny valley they created was overwhelming. Even Samantha Eggar admitted she avoided looking them in the eyes between takes. So the question remains, when you put a child in the costume of violence, do you make the monster or do you reveal one? Fact #3. Canada rejected its own creation. Despite being a Canadian production, funded and filmed on Canadian soil, The Brood faced resistance from its own country. Provincial censors balked at the film's depiction of maternal rage, physical transformation, and its terrifying suggestion that children could be products of hatred, not love. Quebec in particular refused to screen the film upon release, calling it psychologically corrosive and a danger to public sensibilities. In Europe, the United Kingdom nearly placed it on its notorious video nasties list, and yet no specific scene could be pointed to as the justification. It wasn't the gore, it wasn't profanity, it was tone. It was the feeling that the film left behind. Years later, that same film would be dissected in university psychology and film theory courses. It would be praised for its metaphorical density, its commentary on repressed trauma, and its critique of therapeutic failure. So what changed? Did society mature into understanding? Or did we simply become numb enough to finally accept the reflection? Fact #4. The most primal moment was shot without any filters or mercy. There's a scene in The Brood that feels less like a moment in a horror film and more like something ancient, something ritualistic. It's the infamous birthing scene, in which Nola delivers a creature from a sack protruding from her abdomen, No medical tools, no screams, just a quiet, chilling calm. Then, she leans forward and begins to lick the blood off the newborn. Audiences assumed this was sleight of hand stage blood, careful editing, a prosthetic tongue, but it wasn't. Samantha Eggar, the actress behind Nola, later revealed that what we saw on screen was entirely real. The blood was actual calf's blood. The act was not faked. She did it in one take. Why? Because Eggar believed this character wasn't performing horror. She was embodying something ancient and raw. It wasn't madness, she said. It was instinct. And that's what terrified me the most. Cronenberg didn't stage a monster birth. He presented motherhood as something alien and sacred, and grotesque all at once. So if horror usually works by exaggeration, what does it mean when the most disturbing moment in the film required no exaggeration at all? Fact #5. Oliver Reed fought the film and it fought back. Oliver Reed was a veteran of large-scale productions, dramatic roles, and larger-than-life performances. The Brood was something else entirely. Cold lighting, sparse dialogue, sterile environments, and a director who told him to pull back, not expand. From the beginning, Reed didn't hide his contempt. He questioned the script. He questioned Cronenberg's choices. He even reportedly argued about wardrobe, insisting that Dr. Raglan deserved a better coat. But something happened once the camera started rolling. Reed's frustration, his restrained resentment bled into the performance. The result was a psychiatrist who seemed emotionally brittle under his professional mask. Someone who spoke like he was holding something volatile just behind the eyes. Crew members noticed it, so did audiences, and perhaps Reed himself did too. By the end of filming, his attitude hadn't changed, but his portrayal had left a mark. So, did he act the role or just let his own discontent take over the screen? And in a film about emotional contagion, is there any difference? Fact #6. Her clothes weren't costume. They were a cage of skin. Every time Nola appears on screen, she's wearing the same drab, gray-beige institutional garment, something between a medical gown and a prison shift. It's forgettable at first glance, but the longer it lingers, the more it begins to feel like another form of captivity. Costume designer Delphine White revealed that the outfit was constructed from rough textured wool and stiff synthetic fabric, intentionally chosen to restrict movement and cause low-grade irritation during long shoots. The garment wasn't meant to express personality, it was meant to suppress it. The sleeves were slightly too long, the neckline was tight, the seams scratched. Samantha Eggar admitted it affected her performance not just physically, but psychologically. "I didn't feel like I was in costume," she said. "I felt confined." The symbolism couldn't be clearer. Nola isn't just being observed, she's being contained, not healed, controlled. So the question lingers, was she ever a patient seeking help? Fact #7. Psychoplasmics wasn't just invented, it was a twisted echo of real therapy. In The Brood, Dr. Raglan practices a radical form of therapy called psychoplasmics, where repressed emotional trauma manifests physically on the patient's body, tumors, boils, deformities. It feels absurd, disturbing, impossible, but the idea didn't come from pure fiction. Cronenberg based it on real experimental therapies emerging in the 1,970 seconds, especially primal scream therapy, which claimed that re-experiencing early emotional trauma could cure neuroses. That therapy focused on catharsis, on yelling your inner child's pain into the void. Cronenberg, ever the skeptic, flipped the theory. What if pain doesn't disappear after it's expressed? What if, instead, it festers, and worse grows? In The Brood, this emotional discharge doesn't bring peace. It births monsters. Rage takes form, grief grows limbs, and fear becomes fatal. There's something tragic in the film's logic, that some emotions are so deeply rooted, so violently suppressed, they can no longer be processed by the mind alone. They need a body. Any body. So the question isn't whether therapy can heal. It's what happens when therapy opens a door and has no plan to close it. Fact #8. A plastic toy became a tool for murder. Violence in The Brood arrives not with spectacle, but with stillness, sudden, clinical, and jarringly misplaced. The most haunting example? A teacher being bludgeoned to death in front of her students. The weapon? A child's toy hammer. The setting is pastel-colored, childlike, innocent. Paper animals hang from the ceiling. Small shoes line the cubbies. But in this sanitized space, the murder unfolds with eerie calm. The attackers are silent, small, and unrelenting. No music, no frantic cuts. Just steady brutality. The toy itself was modified by the prop department, Although lightweight on the surface, it had a solid interior core to endure repeated strikes during filming. The actress wore internal padding, but the emotional impact couldn't be softened. This wasn't just about shock. It was a thematic rupture. If violence can erupt in the safest spaces, what protection is real? And when the hands that hold the weapon are tiny and emotionless, what does that say about what we pass down, even without meaning to? Fact #9. Navel-less creatures don't just look wrong, they feel unborn. One of the most unsettling details in The Brood isn't obvious at first. The monstrous children The Brood don't have belly buttons. That design choice was intentional. Cronenberg wanted to drive home the idea that these things weren't born in any natural sense. They didn't come from gestation. There were no umbilical cords, no wombs, no biological lineage. They were pure rage, materialized thought, emotion in flesh. Makeup supervisor Jack Young said removing the navels from the latex suits was one of the smallest but most disturbing adjustments they made, because the absence of a belly button severs the creature's connection to origin, to human process, to family, to identity. They don't speak, they don't cry, they don't relate. They exist to act out something someone else refuses to admit. And maybe that's the scariest part, because what do you call something that didn't grow, but simply appeared fully formed and full of purpose? Fact #0. Her performance wasn't restrained, it was surgically flattened. Samantha Eggar's portrayal of Nola Carveth is one of the most haunting performances in horror, not because she screams, cries, or loses control, but because she doesn't. She is terrifying in her stillness, in the absence of emotion where it should erupt. Cronenberg gave her specific direction: suppress everything. No dramatic tears, no visible anguish, no modulation in tone. He wanted Nola to feel as though she were operating behind a thick layer of sedation, a character whose madness is not explosive, but internalized so deeply it has lost all shape. Eggar struggled with this approach. "It went against every instinct I had as an actress," she said later. But it was exactly that conflict that made her so compelling. The result was a woman who doesn't seem alive so much as preserved, like something that's been emotionally embalmed. And that preservation makes the horror worse. When Nola finally births her creatures, there's no catharsis. There's only ritual, cold, automatic, and inhuman. So what's more frightening in horror? A scream? Or the moment where you know it should come and doesn't? Fact #9. The soundtrack whispers, but what it says sticks. The score and sound design of The Brood don't operate like traditional horror. There are no sharp strings to announce danger, no cues to brace you for fear. Instead, the film opts for restraint sounds that almost disappear into the background until they don't. Sound designer Brian Day layered together eerie, nearly imperceptible elements: distorted baby noises reversed and stretched, slowed breathing with unnatural gaps, and low-frequency vibrations that are felt more than heard. The most infamous moment, the birthing sequence, is almost completely silent. But if you listen closely, there's a soft, wet gurgling under the quiet, a subtle, irregular heartbeat, a fragment of something that might be cooing or choking. This isn't just sound, it's psychological manipulation. It unsettles not because it's loud, but because your brain can't quite identify it. It feels wrong before you understand why. So the question isn't what you heard in The Brood. It's what followed you out of the room afterward, even if you didn't notice it at first. Fact #2. The last frame doesn't end the story, it contaminates it. The final moments of The Brood don't offer resolution. Nola is dead. The creatures are gone. Frank takes Candace away. But the camera lingers, and then just barely you see it. A red, inflamed mark on the child's arm. Is it a scrape? A bruise? Or the beginning of something else entirely? Some viewers dismissed it as coincidence. Others saw it as a dark epilogue, a suggestion that the cycle hasn't ended, only changed form. The rage that created The Brood hasn't died. It's moved from one generation to the next. Cronenberg never explained. And that's exactly why the scene still lingers, decades later. Because the most terrifying implication in The Brood isn't that monsters can be born. It's that they don't always die when the credits roll. Sometimes they wait, and sometimes they inherit a new name. Fact #3. The poster promised a lie to protect a truth too raw to market. Long before audiences witnessed a single frame of The Brood, they were introduced to its mythology through an image, the film's theatrical poster. A pale, child-sized figure with misshapen limbs and a hollow expression, frozen in a fetal curl, stared back from a blood-colored background. It was unforgettable, and it was completely fabricated. That image never appears in the film. It was created purely for marketing, not to sell tickets, but to provoke fear, confusion, and ultimately censorship. The poster was banned in several regions. In others, it was torn down before opening night. And Cronenberg? He didn't object. He approved it, not because it told the story accurately, but because it told the truth emotionally. The Brood wasn't about monsters. It was about the impulse that creates monsters, the suppressed rage, the damage we deny, the things we pass down unintentionally. The poster captured that perfectly. A child that shouldn't exist, a thing born from a place we don't speak of. So maybe the poster wasn't misleading. Maybe it was just too honest, and that's why it had to be buried. Fact, Hasson 4. Courtrooms weren't shown, but they built the entire script. You won't see a custody hearing in The Brood. No judges, no lawyers, no legal jargon. And yet, every scene in the film drips with the tension of a courtroom that never ends, one that exists between two people who once shared love and now share only blame. Behind the monsters and psychoplasmics is a story about divorce, about emotional fallout, about a child being passed like a silent artifact between two damaged adults. Cronenberg wasn't coy about it. He wrote the script while fighting for custody of his own daughter. The metaphors weren't subtle to him. He wasn't writing allegory. He was writing through something. Frank's coldness, Nola's instability, Candace's silence. None of these are exaggerated. They're amplified echoes of a very real domestic war, one that doesn't end when someone wins, but when someone stops trying. So when we talk about The Brood as horror, we have to ask, was the fear in the film really about creatures? Or was it about what happens when love collapses and the child doesn't scream because they've already stopped expecting to be heard? Fact, Hasson 5. The blood smelled wrong because it wasn't blood at all. One of the reasons The Brood feels so uncomfortable, so physically revolting, is that the gore doesn't look stylized. It looks off, thicker, sticky, almost decomposing. That wasn't an accident. The blood used in the film wasn't the usual mix of syrup and dye. After their supplier ran out of traditional fake blood ingredients, the crew resorted to using expired cherry juice concentrate, blended with corn syrup and pigment. It was cloying, sweet, and foul. Samantha Egger said the smell made her nauseous. One crew member compared it to rotting cough syrup. But Cronenberg approved the change. In fact, he liked it. The unnatural texture gave the violence a feeling of sickness, not spectacle. It made the wounds look infected, like something had gone bad inside the body long before the skin ever broke. In horror, blood usually symbolizes life. But in The Brood, it symbolizes decay not just of flesh, but of everything that holds people together. So maybe the gore isn't there to scare you. Maybe it's there to show you what emotional rot actually looks like when it leaks through the surface. Fact, Hasson 6. A school board tried to erase the film but only exposed its nerve. When The Brood was released, the most severe backlash didn't come from religious groups, censors, or even film critics. It came from the school system. The scene in question? A gentle elementary school teacher is brutally killed in front of a room full of small children. The attack is silent, methodical, committed by child-sized creatures with cold, expressionless faces. It struck a nerve that many viewers never fully recovered from, especially educators. In Ontario, a coalition of school board representatives filed a formal request to have the film pulled from public screenings. They argued that it blurred the boundaries between fiction and real emotional harm, particularly with its use of children as passive witnesses to violence. But here's the twist. That was the whole point. Cronenberg wasn't depicting literal child violence. He was illustrating how the byproducts of adult dysfunction, rage, silence, fear, often manifest not in dramatic outbursts, but in quiet, irreversible consequences. So maybe it wasn't the blood that disturbed the school board. Maybe it was the film's suggestion that children don't have to act like monsters to carry the results of monstrous parenting. Fact, Hasson 7. Body count doesn't measure impact, and The Brood proves it. In an era of slasher flicks and gore-filled extravaganzas, The Brood is curiously restrained in terms of death. Fewer than half a dozen people die on screen, and none in particularly graphic fashion by modern standards. Yet ask any viewer what they remember most, and odds are it's not the number, it's the weight of each death. Because in The Brood, violence isn't a punchline or a shock gag. It's personal, it's slow, it creeps in, lands heavy, and never leaves. A teacher killed in daylight. A grandmother attacked during quiet conversation. Each death punctuates a psychological breakdown, not a narrative beat. This was Cronenberg's mission. To show that true horror doesn't need scale, it needs proximity. You're not scared because someone dies. You're scared because you recognize the intimacy of collapse. So when people say The Brood is more disturbing than films with 10 times the carnage, they're right. Because sometimes, one quiet death echoes louder than a dozen loud ones. Fact, Hasson 8, a real psychotherapist, walked out and never looked back. At a private pre-release screening in Toronto, Cronenberg invited a select group of friends, colleagues, and professionals, including a practicing psychotherapist, to preview The Brood. That therapist didn't stay long. According to accounts from the screening, he left during the second act, shortly after the film revealed that therapy, in this world, was not a path to healing, but a pipeline to mutation. He reportedly called the film dangerously misleading and accused it of turning emotional vulnerability into spectacle. Cronenberg didn't deny it, nor did he apologize. He responded later in an interview, "I didn't make this film to represent therapy. I made it to represent how it feels when it doesn't work." That distinction matters, because while The Brood distorts psychology into horror, it doesn't do so carelessly. It asks an uncomfortable question. What happens when the space that promises to fix you ends up feeding the thing inside you instead? And worse, what if no one notices? Fact, Hasson. She never screamed, and that's what made it last. Candice Carveth is the quiet center of The Brood, surrounded by fear, trauma, and things she should never have seen. She says almost nothing. She doesn't lash out. She doesn't cry. She doesn't ask questions, and that's what makes her unforgettable. Cronenberg deliberately directed her character into silence. She wasn't meant to be a child reacting to horror. She was meant to be a reflection of it, a vessel, a living echo. She sees violence, she witnesses death, and she carries all of it without release. By the end of the film, when she's taken away from the madness, we should feel relief, but we don't, because the damage isn't gone, it's just quieter. And that silence is deafening. It's easy to fear monsters. It's harder to face what happens when the child walks away but doesn't blink. So here's the haunting thought. What if Candice wasn't broken? Because she never expected anyone to protect her in the first place. Fact, #20. The monsters died. The story didn't. The Brood ends not with resolution, but with a pause. Nola is dead. The creatures she spawned are lifeless, and Frank drives away with Candice, hoping it's over. But then, the camera hesitates, and on Candice's arm, a small red blemish, almost nothing, easy to miss, but unmistakable. Some see it as metaphor, others believe it's literal. The same mutation that created the Brood is now inside her, passed down not through genetics, but through exposure, through silence, through pain never named, never healed. Cronenberg never confirmed it. He didn't have to, because The Brood isn't about closure, it's about contamination, about how trauma doesn't end with the person who caused it. It mutates, it waits, and sometimes it finds a new host who doesn't even know they've been infected. So if the real horror wasn't what Nola gave birth to, then what happens when the next generation carries the wound but wears no scars? Bonus fact. The Brood wasn't a film about monsters, it was a study in replication. By the time The Brood ends, you've seen physical horror, deformed children, violent deaths, a mother unhinged by grief. But those are surface-level symptoms. The deeper sickness is harder to name. Cronenberg didn't set out to tell a ghost story or a body horror classic. He wrote a closed system, a feedback loop of emotion, repression, and reaction. Every scream unspoken becomes a bruise. Every bruise untreated becomes behavior. And every behavior, if unchallenged, becomes a pattern, repeated by those too young to understand they're reenacting trauma, not choosing it. That's what The Brood really is. A story of emotional genetics. A parent's failure coded into their child's silence. Rage rebranded as survival. Pain passed down not as memory, but as instinct. The monsters aren't the creatures on screen. The monsters are the rituals we replay, the roles we inherit, the damage we don't name, because we're too afraid it might mean looking backward. So when we talk about the horror in The Brood, maybe it's not what's born. Maybe it's what keeps getting reborn again and again inside people who swear they'll do better and never learned how. Some films frighten you with what they show. The Brood frightens you with what it understands. Now we want to hear from you. Which fact reshaped how you see the film, and do you believe trauma can truly pass from one generation to the next, not through biology, but through silence? Share your thoughts below. We read every one. And if there's another film that hides something beneath its skin, something personal, something festering, something never meant to be spoken, tell us. We're already looking. We just haven't opened that file yet.